lunch. We now come to the second of 13 exciting presentations. The title is Faithful, Fragile, Found. Where do clergy find their people? Barbara Blois-MacNaughton. Barbara, we're in your hands.
Good morning. I just need to breathe for a minute. You guys are pretty intimidating, you know that? On purpose, right? Yeah, exactly. Oh, I have a PowerPoint. You pay attention to what I'm doing here. Good morning. In Ecclesiastes, we hear, two are better than one. If one falls, the other lifts them up. Good morning to everyone here and everyone online. I extend my gratitude to the faculty, the staff, and all my classmates. And a special thank you to Reverend Canon Dr. Jody Clark and to Dr. Alida Faber for their contributions to my project. And to Sam for doing our tech today. Thank you, Samuel. It has everything all set up here for us. So the title of my project is Faithful, Fragile, Found, Navigating Our Way Through Friendships in Ministry. So have you ever found yourself in a crowd and suddenly you just felt like you belonged? Most of us can be in a crowd and feel like we're outsiders, but just that place where you belong. Last summer here at AST, I had that experience. I was sitting on the deck of the President's Lodge, and there was this sudden realization of connection or worthiness or belonging, and that inspired this research. Taking Dr. Faber's class, The Ethics of Play and Friendship in the winter of 2024, had me asking, how can we be friends with God? We sing songs like What a Friend We Have in Jesus, but I never considered myself to be truly a friend of God. Jesus says, I no longer call you servants, but friends. But still, I asked myself, what does it mean to be a friend to God? So reading Friendship and the Moral Life by Paul J. Waddell inspired me as well. Waddell says, quote, friendships are not sought, they emerge, end quote. Would my friendship for God emerge for me through this class? So this led me to explore what I understand about how friendships are formed, how Christianity's place in friendship, and the virtues that I hold dear when we have or meet new friends. In the friendship course, we created our own list of virtues that we felt were essential for friendship. This exercise was developed by Benjamin Franklin in an effort to become a better person. So he concentrated on one virtue every week, and he continued that for decades. So this practice has stuck with me. So every Wednesday, and this is Wednesday, so why not switch it today? Last week, my word was respect, and this week, my word is compassion. So that's my word for the week. So every Wednesday, this is on my desk, and I flip it over and concentrate on one of those virtues. Friendship is often taken for granted in everyday life, but not so for clergy. It's complex and it's sometimes a painful subject. So how do we navigate relationships that support us while we maintain our professional boundaries? Where do we find those people with whom we can be truly open and vulnerable? That moment on the deck at the President's Lodge when a group of us were chatting and I suddenly felt connected to everyone and to all of creation, I realized that we were all people who valued the same virtues, who were not afraid to pray together for whatever need might arise, and were not afraid to pray for each other. I felt like I found where I belonged. Alred of Rivaux once said, quote, we call friends only those to whom we have no qualm about entrusting our heart and all its contents, end quote. In a more contemporary idiom, my research question became, as clergy, where do we find our people, those people that we trust with our hearts? Through interviews with 5 United Church clergy who relocated for ministry either through settlement or by choice, I explored this question using a phenomenological research method. Their experience is shaped by faith, and vulnerability and the search for belonging helped form the themes that I will share today. I had questions lined up for my interviews. However, the interviews kind of took on a life of their own. And while all the questions got answered, it was not sort of in a direct question and answer kind of way. Speaking with these clergy and hearing their stories, there's just something about that, sharing our stories, that helps make us more than just colleagues. So I want to declare a bias right off the bat, is that I went into ministry in 2003, first as a lay pastoral minister in training, and then a lay pastoral minister, now we call them DLMs. And then in 2020, thanks to Susan, I changed to the ordination stream. But during this time, I moved 3 times. I moved to Cape Breton from Halifax, I moved to Saskatchewan, and now back to Cape Breton. And in each of those times, I knew very few or no people at all and had to find my place where I belonged. So the title I gave my project, Faithful, Fragile, and Found, arose from the data received, as all the interviewees were faith-filled clergy, committed to their ministries, and committed to forming deep relationships. All the participants had times when, due to the moves in their ministries, they felt vulnerable forming new friendships, which caused them to have some fragility. And then they all came to a place at different points in their ministry where they had finally found where they belonged, either physically or emotionally. And they found a sense of connectedness that would help sustain them in ministry. The overarching theme that came through from my interviews was that belonging was the deepest need. It wasn't said in those specific words, but the emotions expressed and the words spoken combined to offer this need. Today, I will only speak to 4 of the themes that came to the surface throughout the interviews that I felt were the most representative of that sense of belonging. The first theme is the search for authentic friendship in ministry. And this speaks to the depth of loneliness and isolation that ministry people can feel. So often it can be very lonely and isolating when you're in ministry, especially when you move to a new place. And in the book of 1 Kings, we hear of Elijah's loneliness when he says, "I alone am left, and they are seeking my life to take it away." Even God's most faithful of leaders has felt alone in their calling. Ministry is not supposed to be a solo endeavor, although it's often seen as one, which is why it's vital for clergy to find a sense of connection or belonging in the area that they live. Augustine reflects on friendship's deep transformative power when he speaks of friendship. He says, quote, "I could not be happy without friends, not even according to my understanding of happiness at the time," end quote. We see examples of friendship in scripture with a reading from the book of Ruth, where it says, "Do not press me to leave you or to turn back from you. Where you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God." Ruth did not want to leave Naomi alone to navigate her way. And we know that it can be very lonely and isolating to move to a new community where we know no one, or even to go back to our former community where everything has changed. People's lives have moved on and you don't really fit anymore. Trying to find where we belong, trying to find those people we connect with as friends is really tough. Back in the days when there was presbytery, it was thought to be filled with connection for many people, but not for everyone. One participant said, "Presbytery meetings were far away and nobody came to my covenanting. This first year was so lonely, I really craved having colleagues nearby." Another said, "Presbytery felt unwelcoming and it was a long drive anyway. I felt no one really wanted to come that far to see me, so the first year was isolating." Since the time of these experiences, presbytery has ceased to exist in the United Church, and the reality of a region and the possibility of cluster groups has replaced presbytery and conference. One participant said of clusters, "I'm hours from the nearest clergy cluster. The roads are bad in the winter. We don't have monthly in-person meetups like I used to when I served in another place." One minister spoke of feeling cut off from true friendship when they said, I thought ministry would bring me closer to people, but instead, I often feel like I'm on the outside looking in. Many of the clergy I interviewed felt isolated, particularly if they moved to a rural location or to a smaller community, where their only identity was as the ministry person. One participant said, even though we weren't too far from the city, I felt landlocked. I just came home to an empty manse. No one dropped by except church people who needed something. When clergy find themselves without peers or confidants, it's very challenging to carry the load of a congregation or congregations alone. This is where presbytery seemed to fill that gap for many clergy. All of the interviewees spoke of the need for clergy connection, those who could understand the complexities of ministry. And sometimes those complexities are very intense. One participant said, I found it impossible to vent about a difficult family funeral to anyone locally for fear of violating confidences in a tight-knit community. And another said, I felt uncomfortable sharing personal stress in front of congregants, given that the minister's role can overshadow ordinary friendship. And still another said, anytime I disagreed with a friend in the congregation, I was scared we'd cross that invisible line and I'd lose them, both as a friend and a parishioner. If there are no support systems or friends one can count on, isolation can be felt deeply. In today's world, we have social media and Zoom and video calls, which make it much easier to find support. However, there's still that need for physical contact. We see that today when all of us came together with our hugging and our touching and our smiling, that person to drink coffee with or sit with, to get a hug from. And it can be really difficult when you don't have those things. The second theme is navigating friendship and trust in ministry, which speaks to the key issues of friendship, trust, and vocational challenges that occur in the struggle with boundaries and confidentiality. Dietrich Bonhoeffer in Life Together says, quote, a Christian needs another Christian to speak God's word to him. He needs him again and again, and when he becomes uncertain and discouraged, for by himself he cannot help himself without belying the truth, end quote. Bonhoeffer acknowledges that even trusted friendships can falter, and clergy must seek Christ in those moments, whereas clergy, we are often disguise our weakness as our strength. In 2 Corinthians, Paul says, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Many clergy are hesitant to show any signs of being weak, fearing this might undermine their position. And they often find themselves in situations where they don't have any way to find a confidant to share their burdens, and trust is not easily found. This can sometimes lead to blurred lines within the pastoral relationship. Many of my participants noticed when forming friendships within one's congregation, they were taking a huge risk. One participant said, I felt like I couldn't talk about my stressful week because if I said too much, I'd reveal details of people's situations. I had to edit everything in my head. That's like the most important line I heard through the whole thing. I had to edit everything in my head. There's the stressful part of being in ministry. Another said, I was single when I arrived and I needed to unload my feelings, but the only ones I knew were the church folks. And I couldn't break open all my frustrations with them. It's just too complicated. And still another who had not moved as far from her hometown as some of the others said, I brought some existing friends into my congregation, which flipped our relationship a bit. They saw me as a pastor rather than an old friend, and it got complicated if I needed to vent. Discerning where a pastoral relationship ends and a true friendship begins is often tricky. One participant experienced a significant loss during their time in ministry, and they said, I needed someone to talk to about my grief, but the person I leaned on was in the congregation. It helped me survive, but it blurred the lines. Later, I realized it put them in an awkward spot for the rest of the church. Another participant said, there are times when I wanted to share my struggles with my church friends, but I never knew if I was crossing a line. Like, was I still the pastor or was I a friend venting? Too often ministers may find themselves going through a hard time. One participant said, I learned the hard way that not everyone in church is a safe person to open up to. Sometimes what you share in confidence comes back to hurt you. Another participant said, I confided in someone thinking it was a safe place, but later they used that information against me in a church dispute. This shows just how complex and risky making friends in ministry can be. Often when a congregant seems like a source of support, this can easily backfire. No wonder it's hard to find friends when you're in ministry if you have to watch everything you say. Just so you don't say too much or too little. These congregational friendships require careful navigation to avoid conflict of interest or violating boundaries that should be adhered to. The ethical considerations around clergy-congregate relationships need to be addressed when it comes to a minister searching for emotional support. Each participant described the tension between wanting deeper friendships and the pastoral duty to keep confidences or to remain above reproach. Clergy are called to carry others' burdens, yet ministry often lacks the space to express one's own burdens safely. What am I doing wrong, Samuel? This is why I wasn't going to use a PowerPoint. The third theme to explore, the tensions. Oh, it already did change. Okay. Yeah, I guess so. Didn't go to the next one though. The tensions of friendship and clergy life, which speaks to the ethical and emotional complexities of friendship in a pastoral setting, and whether or not we can find safe places within non-church circles. Many clergy found their closest friendships outside the church, in spaces where they're not expected to be on. About this, Henry Nouwen said, quote, a friend who can be silent with us in a moment of despair or confusion, who can stay with us in an hour of grief or bereavement, who can tolerate not knowing, not curing, not healing, and face with us the reality of our powerlessness. That is a friend who cares, end quote. When I think of creating safe spaces, I think of the story of the woman at the well. In the Gospel of John, she meets Jesus and is fearful at first, but after their conversation, she becomes bold in her speech. It's hard for clergy to become vulnerable and share of themselves when they're in a situation that does not feel safe. And finding those safe spaces outside the church is vital. When I asked my participants about making friends outside the church, I heard a variety of answers. One participant said, I'd drive into the city, even though it was a long way, to meet an old friend, and we'd grab dinner and see a show. It gave me a chance to be a normal person, not a minister. Another said, I've connected with friends I met online. It's not face-to-face, but we talk on video chats, and it gives me that sense of my people. Many of the participants spoke of their hobbies and their interests. One participant said, I joined a local gaming group to meet people who aren't part of my church. Having that circle was vital to de-stress and be myself. In contrast, another said, one who liked to read said, a librarian invited me for coffee when I first arrived, and she was not part of my congregation. So I let myself relax more easily. And yet another spoke of joining a sporting team. Every participant described looking intentionally for circles where they were not the minister and could be at ease without parishioners' eyes on them. Every participant spoke of the need to be in spaces where they could turn off, meaning just be themselves for a while and not be the minister. Now it's not changing. You can't touch the screen. Mine's a touch screen, so I can just touch the screen and it jumps. Oh, put the mouse in the right place. Great. Thank you, Samuel. The fourth theme speaks to clergy friendship and the search for belonging and connection within ministry, which will connect with an overarching feeling from my interviewees that belonging is the deepest need. Friendship is at the core of human flourishing, yet often clergy struggle to maintain friendships, those trusted and authentic relationships that we need. In her book, Braving the Wilderness, researcher Brené Brown says, quote, "True belonging is the spiritual practice of believing in and belonging to yourself so deeply that you can share your most authentic self with the world and find sacredness in being both a part of something and standing alone in the wilderness. True belonging doesn't require that you change who you are. It requires that you be who you are." End quote. Is this where the feeling of not belonging comes from with clergy? Do we feel that we can be our authentic selves in our ministries? One participant said, "The church was so small that I had to become friends with the people there. We'd have study groups in my living room and bond deeply. Later, I realized that the lines got blurred when they expected me to take their side in a church conflict because we were friends." Does this sound like an instance where the minister can be authentically themselves? When speaking about belonging, one participant said, "A group of us became like sisters, baking Christmas cookies in my home that kept me going during fights in the church." And another said, "When I moved so far away, I craved a sense of home. Even just being invited for Christmas dinner by one family was huge, and I felt like I belonged." In 1 Samuel, we hear Jonathan became one in spirit with David, and he loved him as himself. This shows the covenantal sense of belonging that David and Jonathan felt for one another, and shows a deep, unbreakable friendship of trust and loyalty, a place where they could be themselves with one another. One participant said of seminary friends, "I don't think I'd still be in ministry if it weren't for my seminary friends. They knew me before I was a minister and remind me of who I really am." Another said, "Those relationships are my lifeline. No matter what happens in ministry, I know I can count on them." Many clergy find their most faithful friendships and places of belonging in spaces where they are free to be themselves. Often this happens in seminary. In Romans, we hear, "We, though many, are one body in Christ." Ministers, like all people, are called to belong with a community of faith, yet many clergy feel like outsiders in their church. The early church fathers helped one another to feel a sense of spiritual belonging by creating small, supportive communities. Today, clergy need support groups or clusters, which are often essential to clergy well-being and mental health. One participant said, "We have a clergy coffee group, and that's where I can be real. No one is trying to impress anyone. We just get it." Whoops. In conclusion, there's not a definitive answer to my question that there's one answer for everyone. The question as clergy, where do we find our people and those we trust with our hearts, is a broad topic. But the interviewees showed how individual clergy responded to each question and how they struggled or overcame this situation in their own context. What I know is clergy friendships are complex. They're shaped by trust and boundaries and a deep need for belonging. And while friendships and ministry can be fragile, they are also faithful and fulfilling when cultivated with care. All the clergy I interviewed had walked through times of connectedness and times through wilderness. Each theme explored in this study highlights the struggles and the rewards of forming connections in a pastoral setting. One participant summed it up well. "I don't need a lot of friends, just a few people who know me completely. Without that, I don't think I could do this work." Another reflected, "Knowing that I have that, I'll call it a safety net, means that I'm not necessarily willing to take risks exactly, but that I'm more confident." Being confident allows clergy to bring their authentic selves to ministry. Being a minister is more than just a 9-to-5 job. It's a calling that each of my participants accepted, and they wouldn't change that. So the thing to remember is that ministry is a journey that cannot be walked alone. We need to reach out to one another for support and know that we are in this together. As Ecclesiastes reminded us, two are better than one. If one falls, the other lifts them up. Thank you. I think we're going to have questions.
Great, Barb, thank you so much. Comments, questions? Grab one over here, Pam.
First, thank you for speaking to the hearts of these ministers in training and to perhaps clergy that are watching online. You're speaking to our hearts for sure. The question I have is, what do you see moving forward, this information and this situation around seeking friendships with the United Church? So how might you be looking to share this information with your region, pastoral care supervisors, so that we can talk more about this?
Well, just 2 weeks ago, the clergy that used to be in the Inverness Guysborough Presbytery met with Robin Brown Hewitt, who is now the cluster animator for the region, Bermuda Nova Scotia region. I still want to call it Region 15. And she's very interested in what we found out and talking about how we can bring clergy together. There is a void in a lot of places where there are not clergy clusters and areas where people feel like they can get together. And there's obviously so distance. You know, one of my interviewees was quite far north. So for them, I mean, getting together with other clergy was almost impossible. So there's a definite need within our region to make sure that the work that Robin is doing now gets out there into the community, for sure.
We have an online question. This is from Sonia. Sonia asks, Barb, I'm wondering if the research revealed a correlation between a lack of friendship, isolation, and burnout.
Absolutely. Although nobody directly made that connection, one of my participants spoke strongly to the fact that she felt that she was very near burnout after her first year in ministry being isolated. So I think there's a definite connection between the ability to be with other people who think the same way, who have the same issues, the same problems that clergy have, and being isolated. Absolutely.
Thank you. Anything else? Susan.
So Barb, two things. One, I'm wondering if you believe that your experience of traveling with a group of colleagues and friends from AST over this 5-year program, if that experience is going to set you up with those folks that you can call in the middle of the night when everything has gone wrong.
Absolutely. We do that now and we'll continue to do that into the future. Absolutely. The connections that I've made here have been so positive, not just for me, but for my ministry as well. And the things that we share together, not just our problems and our burdens, but all the information we share, all the things that we do. You know, the clergy clusters aren't just to help us feel not isolated. They're also to help us be more well-rounded ministry people. And I think that absolutely happens from here.
Great. My other question in terms of your research, were you talking about ecumenical clergy clusters? Like, was there any sense of reaching beyond the United Church of Canada? I mean, I remember in my own experience that sometimes ministerial groups were helpful. Other times they weren't, because folks in those groups didn't believe that women ought to be ordained, or the kind of social stance that United Church of Canada took. It was far more isolating to be a part of those groups than it was inviting.
Only one of my participants was part of an ecumenical clergy group. And they, I think, found it very fulfilling. The other ones didn't speak to being part of an ecumenical group at all. So, but one certainly found it very fulfilling.
Lori.
Thanks. Hi, thanks for your presentation.
Yeah.
So a comment and question.
Sure.
I graduated from here 19 years ago, and I went into a parish for 14 years straight. And mostly I loved it. My very first day here at AST, as the coffee was being served up the hill, I met my best friend. And that has stood me in so much stead. So make friends or be friends across the miles. So even at one point we were, I was here and that person was on the other side of the Canada. One of the things that she said early on, because she moved into ministry slightly before I did, formal ministry, is that she loved her parishioners generally, and so did I. They feel that they know me intimately, and I sometimes become their best friend. Even though I care for them greatly, this is her speaking more or less. I always have to maintain boundaries. I agree with that. Even though I did care for my parishioners so much, there was a kind of boundary. And by the way, long-term ministry becomes different things. I remember a parishioner said, first they're your parishioners, then as you bury them, marry them, confirm them, baptize them, care for them, they become friends, family members, all kinds of things. And in my case, my parish became my new hometown in many ways. But back to the my comment, and that is, I think what my friend shared with me was very helpful for me to make sure that I establish ethical boundaries and protect them as well as myself, and make sure that I found healthy ways to rejuvenate and make sure that my concerns were heard. So I really believe in healthy boundaries while caring greatly.
Absolutely. Yeah.
I will say that after 14 years, I grieved when I left because I was leaving my new hometown in many ways. So I think that that is an issue, maybe another grad project also.
Absolutely.
About those transitions from ministries that have mostly been quite successful.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I don't know if I've really asked a question here so much as commented on what you're speaking about.
Right.
I really love your topic.
Thank you.
And I think it's great that you teach that course on friendship.
It was amazing.
Yeah.
I think Alan had a question.
We had a question. Alan, have a question? Okay. Got a couple of questions online too.
Thank you very much, Barb.
Thank you.
Karen Labax, when she's talking about clergy boundaries, argues that there's a tendency to apply medical models of boundaries to ministry. And she contests that. She says that often in congregations, ministers are relating to peers.
Yes.
And the present chair of our board, Linda Yates, came to St. John's United. And one of the aspects of the introduction of our new minister, was that the clergy person, when she spends more time with people, those are likely to become her friends.
Yeah.
So it was kind of said up front that it was possible that this clergy person would find a few trusted friends in the congregation. I'm wondering if, based on your research, where you would come down on this question, is this still the case that the dominant model for boundaries in ministry is this medical model that is definitely about a huge power imbalance?
I would say no.
Or is there more nuance in that?
Absolutely more nuance. I think you can't not get involved to a deeper level than, say, your doctor would get involved in just your health. Because as clergy, we're involved in every aspect of life, not just how someone's feeling. We're also involved in their children being born and their grandchildren and their funerals and all the things. So I think you couldn't just put those medical boundaries on, you know, it would be too narrow a scope for that. So for me, it needs to be, the boundaries need to be much wider, but there is a place where you blur the lines. Absolutely, you can take that one step too far, but I think it needs to be much broader than medical boundaries.
I have a couple of questions online. First, a statement. Catherine points out that Jesus sent his disciples out in pairs, probably for a reason, right?
Yeah.
Good point. And Beth asks, how did COVID change this for people's experience of friendship and isolation?
We certainly talked about that in our interviews, not in all of them, but in 3 of the 4, we talked about that. And COVID definitely isolated people a lot. You know, people weren't going to visit each other. That's where, and it's unfortunate, the year before COVID is when the United Church changed their structure, and then COVID hit. So we didn't even have time to get used to not having presbyteries and those connections when all of a sudden we had COVID and then there was no connections either. So the best thing that happened to the world at that point was Zoom. You know, so we were able to keep in touch that way, but definitely isolation, depression, all those things. The 3 Ds that Jane talked about: depression, well, maybe not demented, but depression. Yeah. So yeah, I mean, absolutely. We see the stress put on clergy and on our congregations by being away that long. So I think COVID definitely affected. And even now, trying to get back into those groups people are struggling because they don't really want to be that close yet. I don't know if we'll ever get back to the way it used to be.
Mhm.
So.
Okay, interesting. We got 2 questions back here.
I'm curious. I did a whole bunch of work in my former role around clergy support and around working with clergy to help them build healthy support systems. And then I moved, or rather my spouse moved. My question is, did your research, did your conversations ever touch on the family systems of these folks in ministry? Because my experience is that the families, the spouses and children often feel the isolation even more strongly, especially if the minister is going into role for the first time.
Mm-hmm.
And they have no experience about what does it mean to be a child of the manse or the spouse of the minister. Just curious whether you talked about that.
We didn't really talk about that. I mean, I can speak to it personally, but I won't because this isn't about me, but it didn't really come up. The clergy that I spoke to when they went into ministry, all but one were single with no children. So most of their experiences came from their first, because by the time they went into their 2nd or 3rd ministry, they had already created some connections that they carried with them through that. So, but yeah, if you want to talk about how a child feels when their mother's the minister, I'll talk to you later about that. Because I had a 12-year-old when I went into ministry and she was not happy.
Thanks, Barb.
You're
I
welcome.
wanted to go back to the conversation that we just had about boundaries, and that was very good and very vibrant and appreciated. But I think that we have to recognize that in meaningful relationships, there is a mutuality or a reciprocity that needs to be honored and allowed. And well, it's just part of it. But it does blur the boundaries.
It does. Yeah.
People have a need to hold up their end of the relationship
Mhm.
as well.
The people that have been the most effective in finding friendships in their congregations were friends with people who did not ask those questions, like in that quote from Henry Nouwen, the ones who were willing to sit with the hurt and sit with the care and not ask the questions that they knew would cross a boundary for them. So they didn't put their minister in the position that they had to. And those are the friendships that lasted beyond being the minister for them. Really.
Hi, Barb.
Thank you for a great presentation. An area of interest, I don't know if you may have touched on this, but I'd done some research years ago in police ethics. And they also looked at a medical model of vocational or professional role and relating with other circles outside of that role. And those who were unable to find ways of relating and building relationships that did not relate in terms of that role were, like you say, at greater risk of burnout, but also at greater risk of ethical lapses. So just wanting to raise that as being maybe an area of research for this, isolated ministers being at greater risk if they're not able to find ways of building relationships in which they're not the pastor, or at least being able to determine when they're relating with someone within their congregation as a friend and not as a pastor.
Yeah.
Can you do that?
We touched on that a little bit, not necessarily talking about police ethics, but certainly touched on when the lines were blurred and how easily that happened without really anybody even knowing that it was happening at the time. It was only in hindsight that you could look back and say, oh yeah, I overstepped there.
We still have a couple minutes. Don't worry. I have a question too, so just relax.
I look worried.
Yeah, good. No, you look really relaxed. Good. Any other questions? Okay, we've got one over here. Mavis, catch.
Everyone has thanked you. And I want to also, my main thought as we first started having questions is there a place of just telling you how much it means to hear yourself being reflected? I experienced so much of what you said. So I don't want to just say thank you. I want you to know that telling us what you found can be helpful.
Thank you.
I had a comment interested in how it doesn't quite fit exactly in this, but it came to mind in terms of the minister in the pulpit. Because part of what we're talking about in relationships is letting yourself be known. How transparent are we in our friendships with the congregants, and where's the line? And I heard something many years ago that stuck. That for a minister to share things like difficulties in their own life, if it's something that they can teach from and have a conclusion of what was learned from it, that can be a way of letting the people know them better and understand more who they are. But that there's a real danger in sharing if it's in the present. If they're
Absolutely.
currently going through something, that would be putting their need kind of thing or different. So I thought that was kind of related. And then one other thing was how specifically the first ministry, rural, moving to a new culture and so on during COVID. So that was a long period of not being able to meet people or find people, and that sense of not having a person, that was very, very difficult. And if I've had friends across Canada because I've moved a lot, and they were certainly the lifeline. And some of the colleagues from here that I went to AST with. So
One of my participants moved during COVID, ordained during COVID, or just before COVID, moved into her first pastoral charge during COVID and found it very, very isolating. Yeah, very difficult.
I'm still here.
So I just have one kind of concluding comment or question. So yeah, I found your stuff watching you through the whole year fascinating, and it's caused me to reflect the nature of friendship. But you know, we have, I'm going to categorize people. We have acquaintances.
Yep.
We have friends. We have close friends. We have intimates, right? So I'm aware of that range. And we also have people, again, going back to Lori's point, I just did a funeral in the parish. I left 30 years ago. And I got all kinds of hugs and kisses. Like, it was amazing. Right? Like, it was like we were together yesterday. Lori and I were talking about it. It's like intimate, like very tight, because we traveled, we've done these journeys together, right? I just think it's really important what you're doing for us, is giving us a language to really explore the nature of these relationships. So I'm gonna flip it on its head a little bit too, for a second, and say, do we demean congregations and their integrity by holding too firm a boundary? In other words, they can hold some of our stuff. They can hold some of the things that go on in ministry. But it's okay for me to say to you, geez, that session was really bad. Those people were kind of nasty,
Absolutely.
right?
Yeah.
So yeah, could you comment on
As
that?
long as you don't name the person who was nasty, you're good.
Well, no, but we can all see who it was, right? They all know who the person
I know, but you
is.
still don't name it.
Okay.
Yeah, no, we didn't, I would only be speaking from my own experience if I talked about that, because it didn't really come up in my interviews as much. None of the interviewees that I interviewed held that tight a boundary. There was definitely boundaries put in place, but they weren't boundaries that would stop you from being friendly, or like even acquaintance and then friend, but not close friend, you know? So I mean, I'm friends with lots of people in my congregation, but I'm not a close friend with all those people,
Yeah.
right? They don't know intimate stuff about me, that because I would never share that from the pulpit to start with. However, if I had an issue, like Mavis said, that occurred a long time ago and it was resolved, then of course, certainly that it could be a good example of fixing something maybe. But yeah, I don't know if I answered your question, Jody. Or
No,
not.
you didn't get, no, I think you did actually in the last part of your response,
All right.
but you handled a lot of really you have another question?
And it's going to be a question.
Okay, go really quick. Sure.
This has generated some energy. Thank you, Lori, again. So throughout your presentation, one of the things that seemed to occur in the feedback quite often was, I can't be quite myself. I'm not exactly completely me. And that's kind of grating for me a little bit. I moved from an art background in NASCAD into a parish, but I was still an artist. I was still connected, actually. So, and I believe that the ministry, we become ministers, our parishioners, or whatever your congregants, help us become better ministers.
Absolutely.
Through that dynamic and what you spoke about, mutuality. So that was something that was kind of like an either or thing in your feedback. Am I not authentic as a minister because I'm something else that isn't revealed to my parishioners? I think over time, much of who I am is revealed. But yeah, so that little edge, you know, where I think in every one of the feedbacks, it was, well, I can't quite be myself except when I'm away from the parish or away from the congregation. And what is that? Because in fact, we've been called into ministry. We are not the person we used to be. So that's an edge for me. Any thoughts on that? Thank you.
It's certainly something I've been thinking about. It would be, if I was doing another project, that would be my follow-up. What do we mean by I can't be myself or be on? And I think most of them were talking about being like you're on stage, like now. I mean, when I go back and sit down, I'm not going to feel the same as I'm standing right here, right? So, yeah, so being themselves, I think they meant being that kind of relaxed, dressed in my sloppy clothes, and hope nobody comes to the door. Like, I don't know that it was that they were changing their personality as much as they were changing their habits. If that helps to clarify that a little bit. I mean, yeah, I mean, when I go home from work, I don't want to see anybody because I put my old sloppy clothes on and I got my feet up. And I don't want anybody to come to the door. But, yeah.
We do need to stop.
Yeah.
We could go on all day. I warned Barb when she first proposed this question, said, you're going to have lots of questions. Don't worry about your QA. It's going to go on for days and days and days. Okay? I warned you, didn't I?
You did, yeah.
And
Thank you.
so Barb, thank you for really breaking open the whole question of friendship, particularly for clergy going into rural congregations and what their worldview is like, and friendship and warmth and well-being and mental health and spiritual health. You took us in that great adventure, Barb. Thank you so
Yes.
much.
Thank you.